Mae yna argyfyngau enbyd yn digwydd ar hyd hanes ac maen nhw'n arwain at wasgfa ariannol sydd yn ei dro yn arwain at dylodi enbyd. Mae hyn yn wir yn ddieithriad ac mae hanes yn dyst i'r ffaith. Ar adegau o argyfwng enbyd mae llywodraethau yn gweithredu i ddangos i bod nhw yno i amddiffyn ac i helpu drwy gynnig tarian yn erbyn yr elfennau gweithaf. Gadewch ni gymryd un enghraifft amlwg o hanes. Yn dilyn yr ail ryfel byd beth wnaeth Clement Attlee ac Aneurin Bevan, fe athon nhw ati i weithredu ar gymhellion adroddiad Ridley a chryfhau y rheolaethau rhenti a dechrau ar raglen anferthol o adeiladu tai cyhoeddus. Fe soniodd Aneurin Bevan ei hun am yr angen i warchod tenantiaid. Ac mae pobl Cymru'n edrych arno ni yma heddiw i wneud be fedrwn ni i'w hamddiffyn rhag disgyn i dlodi yn wyneb heriau anferthol ôl Covid. Da ni ddim yn gwybod impact llawn Covid eto, fe ddaw yn gliriach wrth i amser fynd yn ei flaen, ond rydyn ni'n dechrau gweld ei heffaith andwyol yn barod, a hyn ar ben dros 10 mlynedd o lymder llethol. Mae cyflogau wedi methu cadw i fyny efo chwyddiant. Mae chwyddiant ar fi'n bwrw ei lefel uchaf ers 10 mlynedd ar hugen, ac mae costau byw ar gynnydd. Ond ar ben hyn, mae rhent wedi cynyddu yn fwy yng Nghymru nag yr un ardal arall o'r Deyrnas Gyfunol, gan weld cynnydd o bron i 2% yn y flwyddyn dwytha yn unig. Mae dros hanner y plant sy'n byw mewn tai rhent yn byw mewn tlodi. Mae'r canran o bobl sy'n byw mewn tlodi yn y sector rhent yn fwy yng Nghymru nag yn unrhyw ran arall o'r Deyrnas Gyfunol. Mae Caerdydd yn ei chael hi'n arbennig o wael efo'r Joseph Rowntree Foundation yn amcangyfri fod nifer yn gwario 35% o'i hincwm ar rhent yn unig. Gall pobl ifanc ddim fforddio prynu tai yn eu cymunedau ac mae rhestrau aros tai gymdeithasol yn hirfaeth. Felly yr unig ddewis ydy rhenti yn breifet, neu i rai yn anffodus byw efo mam a dad, a does nam syndod bod ffigurau'r ONS yn dangos fod treian o bobl rhwng 20 a 10 ar 20 oed yn byw fo'i rhieni yma yng Nghymru. Mae Shelter Cymru wedi gweld rhenti yn dyblu mewn mis mewn rhai achosion, ac Ecorn yng Nghaerdydd yn sôn am landlordiad yn cynyddu rhent o dros 100 y mis i rai tenantiaid. Heb gamau ymyrraeth yna byddwn nhw'n gweld mwy a fwy o bobl yn camfod eu hun yn byw mewn tlodi neu hyd yn oed yn ddi-gartre. Gwn y bydd rhai yn cael braw o ddarllen y cynnig ac yn reddfol wrthwynebu gan gyfeirio at enghreifftiau ble mae polisi o dan y teitl rheolaethau rhent wedi methu. Ac mae hynny'n wir, mae yna arbrofion wedi methu. Ond pam ei bod nhw wedi llunio'n gywir, wedi cael eu targedu ac wedi cael eu cyplysu a chyblethu gyda pholisiau eraill llwyddiannus yna mae'r rheolaethau rent yn bolisi sydd yn llwyddo ac yn boblogaidd. Ac mae'n boblogaidd heddiw, efo dros 2 ran o 2 o bobl yn cefnogi cyflwyno polisi o'r fath yn y Deyrnas Gyfunol yn ôl pôl piniwn diweddar gan YouGov. Noder nad ydy'r cynnig yn cyflwyno math arbennig o system rheoli rhent, ond mae o yn nodi'r angen i osod rheolaeth ar rhenti i lefelau sy'n ateb y gallu i dalu. Wan, gadewch ni edrych ar rhai enghreifftiau. Dydy Llywodraeth Gweriniaeth Iwerddon ddim yn nodedig am fod yn un arbennig o adain chwith. Yn wir, mae'n lywodraeth mwy adain dde. Ond yno, maen nhw wedi cyflwyno camau i rheoli rhent, efo adolygiad rhent heb fod yn llai na bob 2 flynedd a chyfnod 90 niwrnod o notis o'r newid hwnnw. Mae yna barthau pwysau rhent yno ar gyfer ardaloedd ble mae pwysau'n arbennig o uchel ac yn golygu na all rhent gynyddu yn uwch na chwyddiant yn y parthau hynny. Yng Nghatalonia, mae'r Llywodraeth yno wedi cyflwyno trefn sy'n cyfyngu ar y rhent i garfan penodol o bobl, enghraifft os ydy'r rhent yn gydradd i 30% neu'n fwy o'r incwm. Ac wrth gwrs, mae rheolaethau rhenti mewn bodolaeth mewn gwahanol daleithau ar draws yr unol daleithau, ac maen nhw wedi cael eu gyflwyno mewn modd sydd wedi ei targedu yn bwrpasol. Mae'n amlwg felly fod cynnal gwaith paratoadol a pharatoi manwl yn gwbl allweddol i sicrhau llwyddiant polisi o'r fath. Dyna pam mod i'n hynod o falch o fod y Llywodraeth yma heddiw wedi dod i gytundeb efo ni ym Mhlaid Cymru i edrych ar y posibilrwydd o gyflwyno rheoliadau rhent, rheolaethau rhent mewn flin gynnau, fel rhan o becyn ehangach mewn papur gwyn a'r tai. Dyma fydd y cam cyntaf tuag at ddeddfu a sicrhau fod yna dau tecach yma yng Nghymru ein pobl ni. Mae'r cynnig yma felly yn gyfle cychwynnol i ddechrau gwyntyllu'r potensial ar gyfer system deg o reoli rhent a'r cyfraniad y gallai wneud i nod ehangach o warantu hawliau tenantiaid, hawliau pobl i fyw efo to uwch i pen heb y bygythiad o ddigartrefedd yn lluchio cysgod dros i bywydau. Mae o hefyd yn ddatganiad o egwyddor sylfaenol, bod yna anghyfiawnder sylfaenol yn rhefniadaeth bresennol ein cyfundrefn dau, sef fod pobl yn byw mewn tlodi tra bod carfan bach iawn o bobl yn gwneud elw ar eu cefnau. Dwi'n gofyn i aelodau o'r Senedd felly gefnogi'r cynnig yma heddiw a grymuso'r Llywodraeth i fwrw ati gyda'r gwaith paratoadol mwyn rhoi seiliau mewn lle ar gyfer galluogi cyflwyno system o rheoli rent law yn llaw a gwaith ehangach i sicrhau fod gan bawb yr hawl i gartref yma yng Nghymru. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Jonathan Saunders.
I refer members to my own declaration of interest and indeed will be declaring an interest on this debate. I will also be voting very firmly against this legislative proposal, and it doesn't take away the fact that I know the work you've put into this. There is actual clear evidence that rent controls can have large negative effects, both on landlords, tenants and indeed the quality of housing stock. San Francisco's 1994 rent control law led to a 5.1% increase in overall rents over the course of the next 2 decades. The overall rise in rents created a cost of $2.9 billion accrued to current and future renters, and landlords substituting to other types of real estate, which then lowered the housing supply, shifting it towards less affordable types of housing. Now, we're already seeing a pattern that's quite worrying in Wales. Private landlords, financial brokers are telling me that they or their clients are fed up now with so many controls being placed upon them when all they want to do is provide good quality accommodation for a fair rent in return. Many are now selling up their stock or moving over to the holiday let. In fact, between 2018 and 2019 and 2021, Wales has seen over 4,500 private landlords leave the sector. And Minister, you can shake your head, but I have that figure firmly provided to me by Rent Smart Wales themselves in black and white. Now, last week I chaired an estate agents roundtable, and it was made clear that there is an agent in South Wales which manages for over 4,000 units, and they know for a fact that owners are voting with their feet and actually leaving the rented sector. Your proposal, Mabon, would make that wave a tsunami of landlords leaving, and the casualties will be the very people that you actually think you're trying to help. Studies have shown that rent controls lead to a deterioration in housing quality, resulting from landlords' reduced income and, an inclination to keep the upkeep of the housing. Germany introduced a nationwide system of rent controls in 2015, but according to research, this had no persistent effect on rental prices, instead resulting in reducing housing quality. Now, Dr. Simon Brooks has made it clear that providing a sufficient supply of rental accommodation is particularly important in towns such as Llangefni, Holyhead, Milford Haven, Haverfordwest, and Carnarvon and Bangor in Gwynedd. There is no greater example of the failure of socialism in Wales than the absolute carnage that Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru are making of our housing sector. As was made clear in my estate agents roundtable, they believe that you are just driving the quantity of stock available for tenants to rent.
Joanna, can you conclude now, please? This
legislation will be the final straw and will see the very people that you think you are trying to help far off. I would ask all members to support tenants themselves, landlords, and to ensure that our housing stock doesn't deteriorate further, and vote firmly against this. Diolch.
Mike Hedges.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, I actually believe in rent control, and I don't own any house apart from the one I live in. With a shortage of rental properties compared to demand, then without controls, rents will increase continually. With large-scale council house building pre-1979, the private sector rented sector declined, the private rented sector began to grow again after 1989, and is now the second largest tenure in the UK after own occupation. Increases in the private sector rent levels and a focus on reducing housing benefit expenditure has led several commentators, and I agree with them, to call for the reintroduction of some form of private sector rent control. The Rent Act in 1965, introduced by the Labour government led by Harold Wilson, regulated tenancies with fair rents set by independent rent officers. That ended with the Housing Act in 1989, brought in by the Conservatives, and we mentioned 1989 earlier by the date at which the increase in private rented accommodation started to go up. And what are the benefits of rent control? Affordability, prevents displacement, neighbourhood stability. The arguments which are made, like Janet Finsoden made them, but I wrote this out before she even spoke, I expect is that it reduces the availability of rented properties and stops renovation and improvement. Firstly, the high rents on privately rented properties have driven out first-time buyers. I just talk about the area I come from, Plasmarl in Swansea. Initially, it had large numbers of privately rented properties, but as council houses became available, my family, like many others, moved to these new council houses, and the houses left behind were sold, and many people, via mortgage, became owner-occupied and then undertook improvement of those homes. Now these properties are bought and made available for private rent. I must have missed a large-scale renovation of cheaper privately rented properties in East Swansea. Alongside rent control, we do need the large-scale building of social housing. In fact, I talk about that probably more often than people would like to hear it from me. But we need to build up council houses at the rate we built them in the 1950s and 60s. But rent control increases the availability of houses to be bought by people to live in, reduces the cost of rental, gives security on rental costs, removes the incentive to move one tenant out to bring one in paying a higher rent. I mean, I urge everyone to support this today. This is effectively a Labour policy. It's something that the Wilson government brought in, which worked very well. Rolling back the tide of fairness to poor and less well-off people by the Tories in the 1980s got rid of it. We've got an opportunity to bring it back in now for the benefit of all the people renting in Wales. I urge everybody, especially my Labour colleagues, to support what is effectively a socialist solution.
Sioned Williams.
Diolch Dir Prylywydd. The need for shelter is one of the most basic human needs, but this need can be exploited. Many of the problems that we discuss day in, day out with our constituents are related to the housing emergency which has engulfed our communities, because be in no doubt, this is an emergency and it is hitting the poorest and most vulnerable in our society the hardest. We must act to protect them. Housing is the single largest living cost faced by most families in Wales. Uncontrolled increases in rents are forcing too many tenants to pay landlords an unreasonable and ultimately unsustainable proportion of their limited income. The picture painted by the statistics quoted by Mabon and Gwynfor reveals the extent and deepening negative effect of unaffordable unfair rents, which disproportionately hit those on low incomes, deepening inequality, exacerbating already too high levels of poverty. And we know that women, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, young people, refugees, migrants, disabled people, and LGBTQ+ people are all disproportionately affected by economic structures that penalise those on low incomes, whilst also facing discrimination as regards access to housing. As we've heard from Mabon and Gwynfor, rents have increased by also almost 13% in Wales over the last year. Shelter Cymru's casework has seen cases of severe increases, in one instance by as much as 100% per month. And the consequences for those unable to afford these increases are dire, often leading to problem debt, eviction, homelessness. Wages have not increased accordingly, and with fuel prices skyrocketing, as well as the rising cost of everyday essentials, the need to act to ensure an end to the way uncontrolled rents are contributing to the cost of living crisis and wider social inequality is urgent. Economic justice is an equalities issue, The actions of those of us on the progressive wing of politics must match stated ambitions. As Mabon mentioned, we have an opportunity here to put in train the first steps of meaningful action to help tenants, such as considering targeted rent controls and supporting the government's white paper on housing, and in doing so, carry the mantle of the giants of Wales's radical tradition. Fellow members, let's show we are the inheritors of that radical tradition. Poverty limits your freedom to enjoy an enjoyable and authentic life, but even the possibility of being plunged into poverty or losing your home is enough to curtail your freedom. So long as landlords continue to have the capacity to arbitrarily raise rent, tenants will continue to live under a dark cloud of economic uncertainty. This motion is an indication that we as a Senedd would stand up for the rights and freedoms of ordinary people to be able to live their lives without that constant threat. The housing crisis is the result of an economic system that is designed to protect the wealth of the few, not the needs of the many. And without mitigation, such as a form of rent control, this system will remain intact. Diolch.
James Evans.
Diolch, Deputy Llawer. I should declare an interest as somebody who is currently renting a property. Well, comrades, I never thought I would see the day that I would stand here this afternoon to fight against rent controls. Where have they worked? Where have they been a success for the people you claim they would help? No one's told me so far, because the answer is they don't work. No one is denying there is significant pressures for the housing market and there is a lack of homes for young people. However, the answer cannot be more red tape and more regulation, because we are in this position now because of red tape and regulation. Across the whole of Wales in 2021, under this Welsh Labour government's watch, your own draft budget highlighted a measly 4,314 new dwellings were commenced. And it's not going to get any better with the NRW phosphate guidance stopping people building houses. Rent controls and more red tape will not address the housing crisis, but they may make the housing crisis worse. There are landlords in this room today and wider who know that if rent controls are introduced, some of those people may struggle to pay mortgages on those properties. They may struggle to pay the upkeep of properties. Tenants will be evicted as those homes go on the open market, and yet again we'll see more homes going on Airbnb. Rent controls pose a real risk to destabilising the market, and you all know it. And policies like these are just headline grabbers. They don't work, and people will always find a way around the regulations. Young people need access to affordable homes, and we need to do that by deregulating and lessening the burden on the house building sector, Minister, and let's get building, building, building.
Colin Thomas.
Diolch. I have long supported rent controls and I back any moves to address the poverty caused by unreasonable rent increases. The UK's housing market has been in crisis for decades. The fundamental foundations of the system have been broken. The idea that everybody should be entitled to a roof over their head, like so many other areas of our economy, is now subordinated to the whims of market forces and the pursuit of profit. When Margaret Thatcher came to power, her government withdrew funding for councils to build economically productive housing, instead choosing to support rents and mortgages instead. The disastrous right to buy further entrenched market dogma into UK housing policy. Most of the houses sold under this policy were never replaced. It represented a mass sell-off of state assets into the private sector. This ripped up decades of mainstream political agreement on the need for councils to provide social housing. Starting with Clement Attlee's Labour government, the state provided funding to councils to invest in increasing social housing, and for decades, hundreds of thousands of social rented houses were built on average every year. Economically, the justification was obvious. Mass-scale home building meant that house prices and rents remained affordable because of high supply. And when housing is viewed as a financial investment, the opposite is true. There is pressure to restrict supply in order to drive prices up, maximising the profit of those who own the assets. Where house building does take place, it is now largely left to private property developers whose prime motive is to make profit for their shareholders. The rapid and unsustainable growth of a class of buy-to-let landlords since the 1980s has not only undone much of the progress in conditions of tenants, but has driven an explosion in house prices. The increased prices combined with the low supply lead to ever-increasing rents. Rent controls offer one of the most potent tools we have to address this situation. They aren't without precedent, they are fairly common across Europe. In 2016, the Scottish Government brought in the power to impose controls on rents. And in Wales, we must learn the lessons of the failings of the Scottish approach, which were caused by a disappointing timidity and lack of ambition. The aim of rent control should be first and foremost to protect tenants. As a longer-term aim, it should discourage the hoarding of property by buy-to-let landlords and increase those looking to sell. This will provide an increase in supply, allowing tenants to buy their own houses. The Welsh Government's ongoing expansion of social housing will ensure a home for those who do not wish to buy or who remain unable to. And I look forward to the white paper, and I'm pleased the Welsh Government will be embracing rent controls as promised in the manifesto. The effects of the housing crisis are felt most acutely by the young and working class. If we fail to act, we will consign tomorrow's young to a future without housing security. Diolch.
Garwodd a gweinidog newid hinsawdd, Julie James.
Too many things attached to my head. Diolch, Deputy Llywedd. In noting the proposal in the motion for a bill on rent control, I think it is really important to set out the commitment in the programme for government. The commitment in the programme for government reflects the commitment in the 2021 Welsh Labour manifesto to develop a national scheme restricting rents for families and young people priced out of the private rental market and those who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. The programme for government commitment now also reflects the inclusion of rent control in the cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru. Our commitment is to publish a white paper on fair rents and new approaches to making homes affordable for those on low incomes. In line with the cooperation agreement, that will include proposals on rent control. As many of you know, though, rent control does have a somewhat checkered history, with many previous interventions not having had the planned benefit or indeed having some serious negative impacts. We know, for example, that the rent pressure zone legislation introduced in Scotland has not yet been used, and measures introduced in Ireland have had to be substantially redesigned as they've been criticised for having led to rent increases and a contraction in supply. However, there are good examples around the world of rent controls working in the right way for the right purposes. I have to say to the Conservatives opposite that their, phosphate crisis, as they call it, which is preventing the build approach, is in stark contrast to your stated commitment to climate and nature emergencies. How on earth do you think that we can have rivers full of phosphates and build substandard housing all over Greenland in Wales and have a coherent approach to the climate and nature emergencies? I really cannot understand. So, you just really need to take a good look at yourself and get a coherent approach to this. I have met with a large number of interested private sector investors who really like the approach that we have here in Wales. They want, of course, because they are decent human beings, to make sure that they contribute to ensuring that everyone in Wales has access to a decent, affordable and safe home. Because they are very well aware that housing is not just about profit. So I think you are hanging out in the wrong crowd entirely over there on the very right-wing Conservative benches. So we think the approach set out in our programme for government is the right way forward. We will be shortly commissioning independent research so we can all understand what measures have the best chance of success. Building on that research, we will then produce a white paper containing the policy proposals which will be the subject of a consultation. We are, of course, wholly committed to ensuring that everyone in Wales has access to a decent, affordable and safe home. Pivotal to this is ensuring that rents are affordable, and we are, of course, acutely aware of the cost of living crisis facing so many people in Wales. As I said in a debate, Deputy Llywelyn, only yesterday, the Tories on the opposite benches, whilst shouting for sedentary positions at me, are also the party that have frozen the local housing allowance, making sure that people do not have access to affordable rents in the private rented sector if they're on benefits. Really need to take a good look at yourselves. We are putting a raft of measures in place already, including our commitment to building 20,000 new low-carbon social homes for rent. In terms of the private rented sector, I've already referenced the National Leasing Scheme. This builds on our successful pilot and will enable local authorities to lease properties from private property owners for between 5 and 20 years. We have a large number of private investors interested in this. Local authorities will provide these homes at affordable rent to those who would otherwise face potential homelessness. They will provide the support tenants need to sustain their tenancies and thrive in their homes. More broadly, of course, and I just remind Mabon, who didn't quite remember this in his speech, implementation of the Renting Homes Act will transform the landscape for tenants and considerably strengthen their rights. Providing they don't breach their contracts, tenants will have a right to 6 months' notice if the landlord seeks to end the contract. That notice cannot be served in the first 6 months, so they'll have a security of at least a year after moving into their home. Renting homes will provide greater security than elsewhere in the UK for all tenants. There are, of course, many other important provisions in the Act, including around improving the quality of rented homes and making sure they are fit for human habitation. And we will publish a green paper later this year as the next step in bringing forward ending homelessness legislation that will fundamentally reform homelessness services to focus on prevention and rapid rehousing. In terms of the commitment to publishing a white paper reflected in our programme for government, this will explore the role rent control can have in making the private rental market more affordable. It's an extensive and complex area of policy and law, and it's essential to gather the evidence, including international models of rent control and the experience and impact of measures taken in both Scotland and Ireland that Mabon referenced. It's important we learn from the approaches taken in other countries, and in particular, this will include understanding as what has worked well, and rent controls are in place, and what has not worked, and critically, as Carolyn Thomas mentioned, any unintended consequences so that we can iron them out in the measures that we take. As I indicated, for example, in Ireland, the legislation was introduced allowing rents to increase to a maximum of 4% in rent pressure zones, but actually it turned out that inflation was lower than that, and the 4% became a target rather than a cap. So we need to craft our legislation carefully so that we don't have rigid boundaries in place and we can calibrate it across the piece. Anecdotally, the measures there are linked to an increase in evictions, of course, because they have then got a ceiling instead of a cap, which we need to guard against. We will commission the independent research into the rent control so that we do pick up the very good examples that we have. Mabon referenced Catalonia, for example. We know that that's been successful there. Engagement with partners and citizens will be a very important part of this research, which will then inform the policy proposals to be included in the white paper. So in summary, Deputy Llywelyn, I fully support the drive to increase the access to affordable homes and to make this the right of every person in Wales. It is, though, critically important to explore what is the most effective way of achieving this and securing more decent and affordable housing. The white paper will be underpinned by the evidence gathered and provide robust options for future legislation on new approaches to ensure rental affordability. Diolch.
Galwad fawr, Mablab Gwynfor i ateb i ddadl.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Dirprwy Lywydd, a diolch yn fawr iawn i bawb sydd wedi cymryd rhan yn y drafodaeth yma. Diolch i'r gweinidog am ei hymateb cynhwysfawr. Dwi'n ymddiddori, mae'n rhaid dweud efo ymatebion yr cydwadwyr, y meddwl weithio wrach bod nhw wedi sgrifennu ryw araith o flaen llaw ac ddim cymryd dim sylw ar hyn sydd wedi cael ei ddweud, oherwydd tra mae rhywun yn cydnabod y gweinidog ei hun yma wedi cydnabod fod yna wendidau efo rheolaethau rhent. Dwi'n wedi dweud hynny mewn rhai achosion, mae'n enghreifftiau ohono fo yn llwyddo, enghreifftiau amlwg iawn hefyd. Ac da ni'n gwybod mwyn i rheolaethau rent lwyddo fod rhaid iddo fo cael ei gyplysu a'i briodi efo polisiau, ystod o bolisiau eraill. Nid y lleia ohonyn nhw ydy adeiladu fel mae Mike Hedges wedi ddweud hefyd. Ond wrth sôn am adeiladu, mae rhaid ni dderbyn na fydda'ch cyfeillion chi yn y cydwadwyr sydd yn y sector breifat adeiladu yn ateb y galw, oherwydd wrth gwrs mae gen nhw ddiddordeb yn creu proffid ag elw yn unig. Mae'n rhaid i ni sicrhau fod tai cyhoeddus yn cael eu adeiladu unwaith eto gan rymuso ein awdurdodau lleol i'w galluogi nhw i ailadeiladu tai cyngor eto mwyn ateb y galw, oherwydd fod y diffyg stoc ar hyn o bryd yn golygu fod rhai o'r landlordiaid rog yna sydd eisiau manteisio ar bobl i bod nhw'n gwybod bod nhw'n medru cynyddu rent yn gyson ac yn gyson ac yn gyson. Amdani, James.
Do you not agree with me then that the Welsh Government's phosphate guidance is going to stop council house building and social house building in certain parts of Wales?
Mae hwnna'n bryder i fod y polisi yna yn golygu fod nifer o dau cymdeithasol lawr yn Nyffryn Tefi a Sir Fynwy ddim yn cael ei adeiladu ar hyn o bryd, ond mater i'r Llywodraeth ydy hynny. Ond dwi yn falch iawn o glywed fod y Llywodraeth wedi comisiynu ymgynghoriad i fewn i hyn ac yn croesawu hynny'n fawr oherwydd os ydy'r polisi yn mynd i lwyddo, fel da ni wedi ddysgu o gyfnod Clement Attlee ymlaen, os ydym mynd i lwyddo, mae'r rhaid iddo fod yn un sydd wedi cael ei ymchwilio'n drwyadl ac yn priodi fewn i'r polisiau eraill. Felly fyswn ni'n falch iawn, os gwelwch yn dda i'r gweinidog, os ga i weld termau a chyfarwyddiadau y gwaith yna, fysa fo'n ddifyr iawn, ond gadewch i ni yma heddiw felly ddatgan yn cefnogaeth i'r polisi yma yn ei ystyr ehangach yn bod ni eisiau gweld camau'n cael ei cymryd yn cefnogi fod y Llywodraeth yn gwneud hyn efo'r ymchwil a gymryd ddod â papur gwyn ymlaen a sicrhau fod yna dau fforddiadwy i'n pobl yn ein cymunedau ni yma yng Nghymru. Cefnogwch y cynnig. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi.